Today we're going to be going through lesson 7.3 regarding cell transport. Now, before we begin, I want to first clarify that we have to, when we talk about transport, in this lesson we're going to be referring to transport into and out of the cell. Now, the simplest form of transport is called diffusion. Okay, so the cytoplasm of a cell is a solution, meaning it has many different substances dissolved in water. In a solution, some particles tend to move from an area where there are more to less, and this process is called diffusion. Now, it is the driving force behind the movement of many substances across a cell membrane. So we have this scenario where we have more of a substance, we have a higher concentration outside the cell than inside. So we have diffusion occur across that membrane, and it's going to lead to an equalization or equilibrium that's reached when there are the same amount of particles inside the cell as outside and vice versa. So even when equilibrium is reached, the particles will continue to move in both directions across the membrane because there is no change in concentration. Now, it depends on random movements of particles, and they diffuse across membranes without requiring the cell to use additional energy. So we say that diffusion is passive. Now, the movement of materials across the membrane without using cellular energy being passive is very, very, very important. Okay, it would take, if we had to use energy for the movement of every substance, it would take huge amounts of energy, and obviously we don't want to do that. Now, sometimes we have substances that don't need to use energy, but for one reason or another, they cannot pass directly through the cell membrane. When this occurs and we move substances through a special protein channel, we call this facilitated diffusion. So again, it does not require any energy. Now, what we see right here is the most common specialized protein called an aquaporin. Now, aquaporin allows water molecules to passively move from one side of the membrane to the other. And this is a process called osmosis. Now, osmosis is the diffusion of water through a selectively permeable membrane, and it moves water from an area of higher concentration to lower concentration. Now, we have this example of sugar water, okay, and we have this imaginary membrane right here, and so water can't pass through the barrier, but water can pass through the barrier, but sugar cannot. Okay, now the ending result is that we have an equal amount of water by volume on either side of the membrane, but not sugar. Okay, now when the concentration is the same on both sides of this imaginary membrane, so the concentration of water, we say that it is isotonic, which means same strength. Iso meaning same, tonic being strength. Now, if we have more concentration on one side than the other, okay, if the dilute sugar is on its hypertonic or above strength, meaning we have more or a higher concentration on one side than the other. If there's less of a concentration in that solution, it's said to be hypo or below strength. Now, osmotic pressure. So for many organisms to survive, we have to maintain osmotic pressure. So the net movement of water into and out of cells and the force that it exerts, we call that osmotic pressure. Okay, so with our animal cells, as our blood cells, for example, when water moves into and out of at an equal rate, this is isotonic. Now, if we have water leaving the cell quicker than it is moving back into, we say that the solution is hypertonic. It causes the cell to shrink. We don't want this to happen. This occurs in dehydration. Now, if your cells are hypotonic, that means that there is more water moving into cells than moving out. Now, when this occurs, it can cause cells to burst, or lyse is the proper term. Now, with plant cells, we see the same thing. So if you don't water a cell, if you don't water a plant, and we have this net movement of water out, we can see that our plants will droop, so to say, and eventually, ultimately, they will die from not having any water. Okay, so I just went through all of these. I'll go back so you have a second to read through them if needed. Now, some cells, like the eggs laid by fish and frogs, must come into contact with fresh water. These types of cells tend to lack water channels. So water moves into them slowly, so slowly that osmotic pressure does not become a problem. So it is important to remember that eggs are, in fact, going to be a single cell. Okay. Now, lastly, we have active transport. So sometimes we have materials that cannot passively move across the cell membrane. Now, this is either because they have a charge like ions, or they are simply too large. Okay, so any process that requires materials to use energy, we say, is active transport. So like I said, larger molecules can pass this way, and if it's too large to pass directly through the membrane, we can go through a process called endocytosis or exocytosis. Now, with endocytosis, we are bringing materials into the cell. With exocytosis, we are taking materials out of the cell. So with endocytosis, a vesicle will fuse with the cell membrane, opening up and bringing the materials in. With exocytosis, it's the opposite. So if we have a small molecule or ions, we have what's called molecular transport. So we have these transmembrane proteins, this purple structure right here, this protein pump. And with the use of energy, it can change shape and it can move materials into and out of the cell. So many cells use proteins to move calcium, potassium, and sodium ions across cell membranes. And they do this to help with many processes within the cell. We'll talk a lot of detail about one of these transmembrane proteins when we go through cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So a considerable portion of the energy used by cells is done to keep active transport working. And the use of energy in these systems enables cells to keep substances inside the cell so that they can use it for other processes later on. So to go back to this larger molecules, bulk transport can take several forms, bringing stuff into and out of the cell. This is also the way in which viruses such as COVID enter the cell. So a vesicle will fuse, and inside of that vesicle, the copies of the virus will be there, and ultimately it travels to the nucleus where it will infect the cell and cause infection. So we can see here this endocytosis, we're bringing these materials in. The pocket that results will break loose from the outer portion of the cell and forms the vesicle within, and then travels to whatever its target is. With two examples of endocytosis are phagocytosis and penocytosis. With phagocytosis, we are bringing solids in. With penocytosis, we are bringing liquids. So with phagocytosis, we'll sometimes package a food particle, so to say. The cell will engulf it. Single-celled organisms such as amoebas will use this for bringing in food. And the engulfing material in this way does require a considerable amount of energy, and because of that is a form of active transport. So with penocytosis, as I said, we are bringing in liquids. Now, this can be done because food sources are dissolved in liquids, or the cell as it grows needs to have more fluid within to help build the cytoplasm, and it will engulf some of that extracellular fluid. Okay, with exocytosis, the opposite, removing it. Again, we have this vesicle travel to the cell membrane. It will fuse and then eject whatever the contents are in that vesicle outside of the cell. All right, guys, if you have any questions, please make sure to post them in the comments below, or you can send an email to mr.tucker.schs@gmail.com.